Thank you very much, Lascian Corla. I'll be sharing my time with colleagues. I'm taking the first 7 minutes. And I'm glad to get the opportunity to raise this issue and speak on this situation in relation to the redress. I clearly remember the first woman that confided in me about her time in a mother and baby institution. It was about 10 years ago. I was a member of Kilkenny Borough Council at the time, and this lady actually had come to me for advice on a different matter, but she ended up telling me her story in relation to her time in a mother and baby institution. I still remember her sadness when she told me her story, partly as so few in her life knew about it, and it has always stayed with me to this day, and I always felt very glad that she felt she could share her story with me. Since that time, I've had the privilege of meeting and speaking with so many women who were forced into mother and baby institutions. Also, many children who obviously now are in their adulthood who had been born into one of the institutions. Some have found their children or mother, but so many are still looking and still holding out hope, sometimes up to 50 years later, that they will be reunited. On many occasions within this chamber and throughout debates on this issue, I have heard people refer to this period as being a dark time in our history. And I have to say, I've always struggled with this description, as while it certainly was a dark time, and there's no disputing that, I think that trying to confine it completely to history dismisses the serious intergenerational trauma felt today still by so many. And while the state continues to deny justice to both women sent to these state-run institutions and the children born there, it remains, I believe, very much part of our present. In 2007, I was 25 when I had my first son, Emmett. I was not married at this time, and I do think if it had been 1967 or 1977 or even 1987, would I have found myself in a mother and baby institution? Would Emmett even have been taken away from me? And I have to say, I find this really difficult to even think about. I remember how incredibly nerve-wracking the whole labour and birth process were, and I had great support and encouragement by my side. I had great medical help, and particularly from the midwife. I always remember, actually, the midwife stayed past her shift to stay with me. And what exactly must this have been like for women alone, scared, terrified in fact, met not only with little or no medical help, but no encouragement or kindness or support or even a reassuring smile. And tonight, as we discuss this, I am thinking of the woman I met who at 15 was raped. She did not know what pregnancy was or what was happening to her body. I'm thinking about the woman who had a partner when she discovered she was pregnant. They planned to get married, but she was taken away late one evening. She was told she was going on a drive to visit a relative, and then she was driven to Besborough. Her son was taken from her when he was born a few months later. I'm thinking about the woman who told me she tried desperately to get her baby back from the nuns. Eventually, she was told he had been adopted to a county that was very far away from where she was located in the southeast. 30 years later, when she tracked her child down, it turned out that this story had been total lies. In fact, her son had spent the first 8 months of his life less than a mile from her home. I'm thinking about the man I met in his 60s who spent decades looking for his mother. Thankfully, he did find her, but he only had 2 meetings with her before she passed away. When he eventually received his file after she had passed his way, it was filled with countless letters begging to know where her son was. And I'm thinking of the woman that is still looking for her daughter, born 42 years ago in Besborough, and so many others. Now imagine, after all of that, to learn that you might be excluded from the scheme because the institution that you were sent to is not included. Or you only spent the first 3 months of your life there, not the first 6 months. Imagine you are left with certain medical conditions as a result of your time in one of the institutions, but you were only there for 5 months and not 6 months, so you don't qualify for the enhanced medical card. And I know a number of women who are actually left incontinent due to the circumstance of their childbirth, and actually were left traumatised and were unable to form significant relationships going forward because of their kind of embarrassment and shame on that issue. And we shouldn't have to, they shouldn't have to come and tell us such personal stories, but they do. But she didn't spend 6 months in an institution, so she won't be entitled to the enhanced medical card. And another lady who spent 5 months and 20 days, to be exact, in an institution, who actually nearly lost her leg due to sepsis brought on by the horrific treatment during her labour. Again, she falls outside the criteria. Imagine you were boarded out or nursed out, treated like a slave, in many of these situations physically and sexually abused, but you don't qualify for the scheme. There is no price that can be put on any of this, but what the state can do is listen to survivors and their families. Look at the Oak Report, commissioned by you, Minister, and use that as a starting point. People engaged with this process in good faith, again reliving their stories, which was not easy, and now it seems again it was for nothing. Nobody should be excluded from the scheme. It should cover 100% of survivors. The religious institutions and the pharmaceutical companies also need to be held to account for their role in this. They often profited at the expense of children and women, and they must also pay. Survivors and their families are tired of apologies with no action. I do understand, Minister, that you are not the person responsible for the Commission of Investigation, and in fact, you inherited this from predecessors who I believe were happy to kick it down the road to your door. However, you are now in a position where you can, for the first time on behalf of the state, ensure the right thing is done, that survivors are actually listened to and their wishes respected. And you can ensure that nobody is left out of this scheme. I fully believe that you would have the support of each and every one of the TDs here in the Dáil to do this. And I also think that this 33rd Dáil must finally be the Dáil that ensures that justice is done by every single woman and child that had to pass through those horrific institutions. Garmagad.
Minister, I want to tell you about 2 boys from Kerry, James and Michael. They were left to the mercy of this state and suffered a horrendous childhood. They were boarded out from the county home in Killarney, County Kerry, when James was 8.5 and Michael was 7. The state had a duty of care to these little children, but sent them to work in servitude and enforced labour. You're here to work, they were told. The shameful story is of James and Michael Shukru. They were sent to a house which had no lighting, no heating, they weren't properly fed, and having authorised their boarding out, there was no adequate inspections provided by the state. James, who's now 70, told me again today he was physically and sexually abused over many years. He was failed by the social workers that were supposed to protect him, and when his education finished, his school and his council declined him a grant for further education on the basis that there would be no additional benefit to him. James went to Hammersmith and later made a life for himself in London and has suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. Michael was not so fortunate. Growing up, he'd been beaten many, many times, stripped and beaten in public with a stick on one occasion. He suffered with addiction and mental health and was found dead alone in Crystal Palace in 1993. This left a void in James's life which can never be replaced. Later in life, compounding this injustice, James was forgotten by every redress scheme. He was not recognised, he was denied a full Garda investigation. At every hand's turn, the state told him there is nothing we can do. Why, Minister, having listened to James, are you continuing to ignore him? Offering counselling to a man at this stage of his life, he says, is an insult. Give them the comfort of redress, please. For once in this state, let them be included. Or are you going to be like Michael's neighbour who said to James after his funeral, I'm sorry about your brother. We heard his screams, but we did nothing. That's the only apology that they have ever received.
There's countless men and women living in my area who have a history intertwined with the Casa Pollard institution, and I don't have the time to fully express to you the hurt and frustration and disbelief that they have expressed to me. But what I do want to do is place on the record of the Dáil quotes from the open letter written by the survivors of the Casa Pollard institution earlier this year. and it begins: "The sad fact is that losing a baby to forced adoption is a traumatic event in any mother's life, causing a form of post-traumatic stress disorder, and it makes zero difference as how soon after birth this trauma is inflicted. The horror remains, the depression, anxiety, nightmares and flashbacks." The Commission's final report is deeply flawed. Up to 15,000 people were illegally adopted during the timeframe under investigation, and they are excluded. They've spent their entire lives giving false, misleading and potentially lethal family medical histories to doctors and hospital staff. Furthermore, the rest of the county homes were ignored by this Commission. More than 24 escaped investigation. Where is their truth and justice? We listened to the Taoiseach and Taoiseach apologise in the Dáil today. Neither mentioned their own political parties nor their culpability in what is essentially Ireland's own little Holocaust. Insult headed upon injury and salt thrown in the wounds by the empty seats. Apparently, it was society's fault. What was the point in our testifying if the word was to be doubted? Our testimonies are the proof. Neither of this sickening double act in the Dáil today bothered to tell the real and immediate action for living survivors. The living survivor community must take priority. We need action while some of us are alive. Minister, these are the raw, hurt words of survivors, told in their own words in an open letter. They have had enough of political waffle to last them more than a lifetime. They have been failed time and time again. Actions, not words, is what's needed now, because people start to heal the moment that they feel heard, and these survivors have yet to feel heard. Don't deny them. Again, Minister, don't let it be on your watch. Ensure that justice is finally delivered.
Paula, throughout my discussions with you all the time, you, Minister, you've always seemed to genuinely care about the survivors and want to do the right thing by them, and I won't deny that. But unfortunately at this stage, it seems as if you're being prevented by your colleagues, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in government, from doing the right thing here. And they have a desperate track record on this issue. They're stuck up to their nicks, and make no mistake about it. And it's not just them, because it's the religious institutions, it's the embassies, the justice system. They were all responsible for keeping these hellholes open and putting families through what happened. And now we're effectively talking about human trafficking here, and I've said it here in this House before. Yet a 6-month exclusion now has been put in and been drawn by the government, which denies 41% of people that were in these from getting redress. Let's make no mistake, these homes and institutions were a money-making machine for an awful lot of people down through the decades. And now we're denying families and individuals. And I said it to you here the other day, most of them, all they want is recognition. But we're even denying them that. It was brought up already about children that were boarded out. They must be included, Minister. And there must be more consultation with the religious orders. They have a responsibility, and the pharmaceutical companies have a responsibility in these issues. Women who went through these institutions, those like him, like Sean Ross, like the county homes in Thurles and in Cashel, my own constituency, the survivors, they deserve to be heard. They deserve to be listened to at this stage. I'm asking you, Minister, to do the right thing here, to actually review the whole thing immediately, the redress scheme, because it isn't wanted. It's not making the survivors happy even. It's just adding more hurt on top of hurt, what has gone on for decades. So I'm asking you to, I hate saying it, to stand up to the Fianna Fáil Fine Gaels that were stuck up to their nicks in it down through the decades. But that seems to be the only way that the survivors will get actually what they deserve at this stage. So I'm pleading with you on behalf of the survivors that have been contacting me and everyone here in this House to actually do the right thing by survivors at this stage.
Minister, I tried over the last few days to think of new words that will somehow crack through the state's deep-seated denial and awful treatment of the mother and baby home survivors. Women, girls and children who suffered horrific abuse and human rights violations in these religious prisons. One in my own constituency of Meath West, the Castle Pollard Mother and Baby Home. I don't have words strong enough to split the state's cruel and coercent attitude of disrespect towards survivors. It is an attitude beyond any language, I know. It stands in stark contrast to the human dignity of the survivors and their families. These women have been to hell and back. If it wasn't for their courage and bravery, the shameful legacy of the mother and baby homes would have remained shrouded in secrecy, swept under the carpet. There would have been no commission of investigation, no state apology, no redress scheme. The survivors had to push the state every inch of this torturous journey. They had to chip away at a wall of silence. The redress scheme published last week is an insult to the survivors. It is an extension of the flood of disrespect that these women and their families have waded through for decades. It is shameful that the government has brought forward a scheme that creates a hierarchy of victims by taking the view that some mothers and their children suffered less than others. It is cruel to deny compensation and medical supports to some survivors simply because they were taken from their mother or left the institution before 6 months. Not only is it callous, it flies in the face of modern clinical evidence regarding the traumatic impact of forced separation on babies of that age. The idea that it didn't affect them because they were under 6 months is not only morally repugnant, it is also nonsense in a scientific sense. It is wrong that the Minister would seek to justify this botched scheme in this way. This needs to be rectified. No matter how long you spent in these places, no matter what age you were when you left, you suffered greatly and you carry the trauma and the pain with you to this day. And religious institutions are responsible for that pain and trauma too, and they must contribute to the scheme. The state cannot allow them to wipe their hands. The timing of the scheme is also disrespectful. The Minister announced the scheme in full knowledge that in the very same week survivors were in the High Court challenging the report of the Commission. The report on whose recommendation the scheme is based. Recommendations which survivors described as whitewashing of their abuse, especially the contention that no forced separation took place. This scheme continues the disrespect demonstrated in attempts to seal survivors' records, in the leaking of the Commission's report to the media before survivors had a chance to see it, in the destroying of survivors' evidence given to the Commission. What is so fundamentally wrong with this state in 2021 that it would seek to prolong rather than help ease the trauma of these women? This exposes again the deep and the dark psyche of a state that puts its claustrophobic interest above those citizens brutalised in its name. Women, girls, children who cry out for justice, for dignity, for basic humanity, and a state that pushes back against those cries at each and every turn. Minister, survivors don't want this botched report. They want an equal scheme in which everyone's hurt and trauma is recognised. They are not willing to leave behind anyone who spent a single breathing moment incarcerated in those wretched places. That is an integrity, a strength and a compassion to which we should all aspire. Ireland would be a better place if we did. Minister, listen to the survivors, finally listen to them. Deliver a scheme that matches the gravity of their experiences, a scheme that is fair, just and equal for all. Thank you.
Minister, the redress scheme needs to be reviewed as a matter of urgency and proper consultation with organisations representing survivors of institutions which oversaw the forced separation of mothers and babies needs to take place immediately. Like all those affected need to be treated equally and fairly, regardless of age when separated, whether they were boarded out or what institution they were in or indeed how long they spent there. I mean, the state has failed women and it has failed the children who were forcibly removed from their mother. It doesn't matter what age the person was when they were actually removed from their family. It has had an impact on them. So for this redress scheme to exclude children under 6 months of age is inequitable. I've heard from many of the survivors of these institutions, including the ones named under the scheme and those indeed that aren't, and their stories are heartbreaking. And again, it doesn't matter what age they were. They've been very much affected throughout their lives. Many survivors will tell you that they may have been adopted by a perfectly lovely family who gave them a good upbringing, but does not take away the different feelings of separation, sense of loss, the feeling of not being wanted or not knowing who they are or why they were adopted. And there has been research that would indicate that children of less than 6 months in age are affected by separation, and indeed only people who've been adopted can understand the concept of not having a sense of belonging or knowing exactly who they are. I cannot understand why children who were boarded out are not included in this redress scheme. Many of those children were nothing short of slaves and were often terribly treated. It was common for farming families to have a boy or a number of boys on the farm to work. And while some may have been treated fairly well, many were not. And once they reached the age of 14, left this country forever. And who would blame them? Like, they felt unwanted then and they feel unwanted now after they've been ignored again. So there is a need to include everyone. in this scheme, no matter what age they were or what institution they were in. Religious orders and pharmaceutical companies need to finance the redress scheme, or at least contribute to it. Substantive recourse from these bodies needs to be sought immediately. In fact, insisted on immediately. Thank you.
Ich habe den Mark Ward.
Well, I'm not a good last count caller. Minister, as you know, I'm a member of the Children's Disability Equality and Integration Committee, and we heard at that committee the heartbreaking testimonies from those affected by the mother and baby homes. And the last time I spoke on this, I read testimonies of survivors that they made to the Commission of Investigation, and I'm going to do it again tonight, Minister, because it's important to hear these women's voices. One woman spoke about the conditions her mother endured while giving birth. My mother was tied to the bed, and when she couldn't push, one of the nuns sat on her chest to make her. On the immoral and evil practice of forced adoption, one person stated, "My son was wrenched from my breast by one of the nuns while I was feeding him and taken away for adoption. At no time did I give my consent to my son's adoption." Another mother spoke about the death of her child. I do not even know whether he was buried in a coffin. There was never even a kind or sympathetic word said to me. The psychological impact on mothers has been enormous. This mother said, the nuns at Bessborough made my life hell and changed my life forever. I could not get over what happened to me. I think I'm still in shock and traumatised. My time at Bessborough was a horrific, horrible experience, and I think I will die with pain and trauma that this has caused me during this time. Minister, the reality is, if any of these survivors, and these testimonies that I read out, spent less than 6 months in a mother and baby institution, they would not be eligible for the full redress. Minister, this has to be changed for a whole myriad of reasons. These stories are horrific. They're actually harrowing and heartbreaking. It's emotional even reading them out on behalf of these women. And these women and children were abused by the state already. Minister, let's not abuse them again. Good.
Too little and too late best describes the state response to the suffering of its citizens in these institutions. We were far too late in stopping the practices in these mother and baby homes. We were far too late when we set up the Commission of Investigation, the final report of which was best described by my party colleague as a miscarriage of truth. And it's been too little in terms of the amount of redress and the number of people's proposed included in the scheme. This government, your government, has failed at every turn when it comes to the survivors of these penal-like institutions, and now they will be failed again. Why must it always be like this? I'll reference a different case, sexual abuse in day schools. I explained to various education ministers over the years the case of sexual abuse in such a school, Crelane in Limerick. At the time, those ministers seemed upset and promised to act. However, their failure to act leaves me to believe that any fair solution they had were torpedoed by officials in their department. Minister, I ask the same question. Did the same happen to yourself? When Louise O'Keeffe won her case in Europe, it took years for the survivors to be included in redress. These brave men at Crelane School had to protest in Brussels and at the gates of the Dáil here to achieve fairness. Well, the survivors in the mother and baby home need to do the same. I hope to God they don't. At every point in the mother and baby home process, the government have imposed obstacles to survivors. The final report underplayed the actions of those institutions. These women were interned and their children were kidnapped. That is a stark reality of what actually happened. And now we expect to accept that there will be a hierarchy of survivors. We're expected to accept that those boarded out children are to be excluded. We are expected to accept the redress scheme that is based on a Commission report that is itself extremely flawed. Well, it can't be accepted, and it won't be accepted by the survivors I've spoken to. What can be accepted is a commitment to remove the time-based redress criteria, a commitment that those who were boarded out will be included in the scheme. What can be accepted is fairness for all survivors. The responsibility and the shame is with those organisations that ran those homes of hardship. TDs from all parties read the accounts from the survivors last year. Many of us were emotional when we spoke about the horrendous wrongs that were done to the women and children in those homes. I appeal to those on the government benches to be sympathetic to the needs of all the survivors, support this motion, and together we can at the very least ease some of their pain in this. Minister,
I do welcome the very fact that the government are not going to oppose this tonight. Look, you've heard the statements from speakers in here tonight, and it's true, and we've all known people that have been directly affected by it, and obviously, Minister, you've been in direct touch with them. But when you listen to witness statements and saying how they breastfed their child while facing a wall, and to have that child torn from their breast and taken nearly 45 years to see him, you tell me it's not traumatic. It's been mentioned already here, the state, the church, pharmaceuticals, the legal profession, undertakers. We're not finished with this at all yet, Minister. I mean, and people are coming forward all the time. But I would urge I suppose that's for the utmost urgency in trying to get some kind of redress, but the advanced or the enhanced medical cards, from a lot of people I've been speaking to, the survivors are very anxious to get them because they're getting old and they're getting frail. The cost of dental work and other medical procedures is extremely expensive, and they're only looking for a bit of quality of life. They've gone through their suffering. They're going through the pain now. Yes, a lot of them wanted to tell their stories, just to tell their stories. They weren't looking for a pat on the back, but they needed to offload. But we're here again, and I was thinking when I was listening to the rest of the speakers a while ago, and I was going, geez, my God, I said, this is probably we've had many dark times in our history. But this one we should be really, really ashamed of, because we left our own people down. We left mothers, children, grandparents. And if we can't stand up today and admit, look, it was certainly a collective thing. They were all in it together. They should be all in it together to sort it out. And we have a responsibility in that. So I'd ask for urgency on it. Cormail Margaret. Thank you. Let's go.
The facts have been laid bare to the nation about the scandal of the mother and baby's homes. The survivors had to fight every inch of the way to even be heard, let alone be recognised. Now they face another botched scheme, and with no disrespect intended, it was designed, no doubt, by people who never had anyone belonging to them in these institutions, or known anyone who endured the hardships they suffered. It is in this context the people of Ireland that are outraged at the latest attempt to bring forward a much flawed and diluted mother and baby institutions payment scheme. A scheme that will leave hundreds of survivors from obtaining enhanced medical cards because the period spent was less than 6 months. A scheme that, for all intents and purposes, created a hierarchy of suffering and pain, differentiating and categorising each survivor as if one person's pain and suffering was not the same as anyone who stepped over these notorious thresholds. A scheme that excluded innocent children, especially those who were boarded out and those who spent less than 6 months in these cold, oppressive and callous institutions, about 60% in total. This scheme must be redesigned, Minister, and we must as a nation do far more for those survivors of these oppressive, inhuman institutions who treat their mothers and babies like chattel. We are calling on the government now to listen to the ordinary, decent people who want this sorted out in a dignified and honourable way. And speaking of honour, it will be remiss of us not to mention Catherine Corliss and her relentless fortitude in her search for justice for the babies and mothers who perished in Tuam. The Taoiseach in his apology said, "The shame is not theirs but ours. It was our shame we did not show them the respect and compassion which we as a country owe them." Then let us do exactly that and rethink, redesign and change this scheme for the memory of all the lost babies and all the survivors of the mothers and babies' homes. Let us do this in the spirit of a nation that really cares and cherishes all the children of the nation equally.
Minister, I suppose the question that everybody across the state wants to know is, why have your government decided that there should be a hierarchy on suffering? That's the question. Who made that decision? Children who were boarded out, many of them used as slaves, many abused, they've been excluded, along with children in these who are less than 6 months in these appalling institutions. They're excluded, and a number of homes and institutions and all of the survivors who spend time in them, they've all been excluded. And that means that they can't access the enhanced medical card or the financial redress. But it's much, much worse than that, Minister. It means that the state doesn't actually recognise what happened to them. That's the biggest insult of all. The scheme has created an appalling hierarchy of victims and a clumsy hierarchy of suffering that does not reflect the experiences that survivors have had. And yet you say you listen to survivors. It needs to be rectified immediately, Minister, before more hurt and trauma is inflicted by the state on survivors. And let's remember, the state is responsible for the harm that was done, and it must take responsibility for that. The time limits that exclude survivors has to be removed. The institutions and children who were boarded out must be included. The religious orders and the pharmaceutical companies must also step up and take responsibility for what they did. And the government, I know you've said you've been in negotiations with them, but you have to ensure that that happens. I would say to you that all of these abuses have lifelong effects on people. And survivors, you know, at this stage, after all this time that has passed, they're still being excluded. There was one opportunity to address it, Minister. It has to be addressed. Let the government do the right thing in the name of God after decades of campaigning for redress and justice. Just this once, surprise us and do the right thing by these people who are let down by the state.
Minister, it is impossible to calculate the trauma experienced by those who are resident in many of the mother and baby homes across the country. To understand the emotional, psychological and physical distress the survivors still experience to this day is something that can only be comprehended by those who lived through this awful experience. We can only attempt to grasp their suffering by listening to their testimonies, and it is clear from the many stories these survivors tell that they still manifest each and every day the pain of their traumatic past. Each and every day, these survivors face new challenges, and as they get older, they face the additional challenges of declining health, retirement, or losing a spouse. And these may negatively impact for many on their already fragile psychological state. Many show evidence of post-traumatic symptoms, and while their experience may not necessarily have prevented their ability to adapt to daily life, it is certain that for many that to continue living a normal life as best as possible, they would have to repress a lot of these traumatic memories to focus on building a life. For others, the trauma and stress of their experience have left a permanent mark, which has continued to influence their lives. The government could have resolved this matter because it is the right thing to do. Taoiseach Micheál Martin stated recently in the Dáil that not everybody will be satisfied with the entirety of the redress scheme. The Taoiseach needs to understand that it is not just a matter of whether someone is satisfied or not with the proposed scheme, but that the scheme is causing unnecessary distress to survivors. It is in fact re-traumatising those survivors excluded from the scheme and will only continue the pain and hurt these survivors have felt all of their lives. The government needs to look again at this flawed scheme and ensure that no survivor is excluded. Thank you.
Chair. Minister, this scheme isn't fit for purpose and you need to go back to the drawing board. It's been widely condemned by survivors and experts, and on a human level, it dismisses their suffering. And it's basically saying that many of their experiences aren't traumatic enough to receive redress. Boarded out children and infants who spent less than 6 months in these appalling institutions are completely excluded. A group of 30 childhood experts wrote to you over the weekend explaining why this was a shocking decision. Minister, trauma can't be measured by time periods. You completely ignored the views expressed by survivors in the Oak report. That's insulting to survivors who have experienced decades of appalling treatment by this state. You created a hierarchy of victims here, and I don't believe you intended to do that, but that's the reality. The current proposal is heartless and it's tone deaf. Now, I welcome you spoke to religious institutions, but you need to speak to the pharmaceutical companies involved and demand that they too pay for the pain and suffering that they caused. Forced adoptions, forced labour, physical and sexual abuse and vaccine trials happened in these institutions, and they should all be held to account along with the state. It's a dark stain on this state's history. Now, Minister, you need to listen to the criticism of this scheme and make the changes that is needed for it to be acceptable for survivors.
Minister, we wouldn't be here this evening if you use the findings of the OAK consultation with the survivors of the mother and baby homes. Nobody wants to be here. And least of all, the people who are watching in tonight, the survivors, don't want to be watching into this. And I send them our solidarity. And I thank each and every one of them who has engaged with all of us across the House and told us their stories. And some of them tonight, even watching, there's a couple of things that they have risen with me since this debate started. You say you've aimed to seek consensus over division when you talk about the House here. But they are asking, why are you continuously trying to create a divide within survivors? You really need to hear that going out of this chamber here tonight, and you need to include it in the legislation that you're bringing forward. You also say that the government went significantly further when you refer to what the government has done, and they say it's not far enough. And if they say it's not far enough, it's not far enough, Minister. They also, you say about it being the largest scheme of its kind in the history of the state. But they want to remind you that it's also the largest scandal, the largest and most inhumane scandal in the history of the state. So you have to listen, Minister, even at this late stage. I want to remember tonight the tenacity and courage of Catherine Corliss as well in uncovering the scandal of the 796 babies still in the sewage tanks in Tuam, 208 of them from my own county of Mayo. And I want to acknowledge the recent initiatives by Valerie Jennings and Joseph Mulcrone to highlight that to you, and that needs to be done. Minister, please listen to the survivors.
Thanks very much, Cathaoirleach. First of all, I want to thank everybody who is involved in the debate. I also welcome the fact that the motion isn't being opposed. Genuinely, I think, Ministers, you've heard tonight that people do want to work constructively. And I think that is why we brought this motion forward, to highlight the issues. Everybody, and I imagine it was the same for government TDs, that you were inundated as well with people asking why they were excluded from the scheme. Nobody, I don't believe that anybody, no matter whether you're standing in opposition or government, wants to exclude anybody. So that's why we brought the motion forward. And I genuinely hope that there's sincerity when you say you want to work with us and you're not opposing the motion for that reason, because everybody wants a scheme that will suit and that's fit for purpose. And as I said earlier, this has to be the Dáil that finally deals with the issues, because we've been talking about them for so long and people are literally dying as we're debating them. And I do want to reiterate what I said earlier, Minister, that I know a lot of this was left at your door by predecessors that were probably happy enough to leave it there. But you do now have, in a way, an opportunity to actually deal with it properly and constructively and listen to people. The letter was mentioned, the letter that was written to yourself on a number of occasions. And I do want to just read out, some of it was already read out, but I want to just read out these final 2 points. And I think that we should welcome that we have such experts that we can look to, particularly when this does come for the legislation and the pre-leg process. I'm hoping that people like this will feed into that and that we can base this on some of their work. And I think it's excellent, as Deputy Connolly said, that they actually had the courage to come out with this at the weekend. So they say we are seeking a revision of the recommendations arising from the report with inclusion of best practice guidelines regarding neuroscience, childhood trauma and attachment. We are willing to work alongside you to see these changes through and want to meaningfully contribute to better practices rather than simply criticism from the sidelines. One final point, these women and children have experienced complex trauma and adversity in their lives. Yes, the money will help, there's no doubt about it, but there is also an opportunity to right a wrong, to empathise at a human level and seek to understand. We want to minimise the risk of secondary traumatisation and invalidation of survivors and their families, which is most likely where experiences are not heard, respected and redressed. Fundamentally, it is about mothers, children and families being seen, heard and having their lived experiences validated. Collectively, we can surely strive for this. And I think that perfectly sums up what is trying to be achieved by this motion. And it's obviously, these are people who are clinical psychologists, therapeutic social workers. They're obviously working with children and understand trauma very well. And I do think we should take their suggestions on board, although I think everybody would agree this has to be inclusive. It should include all survivors, and particularly around the medical card aspect, because an awful lot of women are re-traumatised by that they were really holding out and waiting for this enhanced medical card, and it's not right that they would be denied it. And I just want to reiterate in relation to interim payments, I do think that's something that should be looked at, and it is being examined in the 6 counties in relation to their report. So again, I just reiterate that I believe there's statements again Thursday on this, so we'll be discussing the topic again. Then I want to thank people for their support in relation to this, and I just want to, I suppose, send solidarity and support to all survivors that were sent to institutions, anybody that was born, their families, because I know that this re-traumatises them every time we talk about it, but it is important to raise the issues as well. And I just, I'm thinking of all of those people that I've met and that we all have met as well.